Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. Thanks so much for joining us. What is that feeling I woke up with today? Hope. That pit in my stomach, the pressure on my chest, the feeling of doom. It's gone. It's gone. We have a fighting chance. Now, remember, we have simply gotten ourselves out of a deep, deep hole. We haven't beaten anyone yet. We haven't run any race of any consequence so far, but we have cleared out the major impediment to defeating Donald Trump. As much as I love President Biden and admire tremendously the job he did, we could not win this election without him. But conversely, it doesn't automatically mean we do win this election now that Kamala Harris is on top of the ticket. We'll have lots to talk about as we go forward about her talents, her abilities, but nothing is guaranteed. Need we say more about this election? Nothing is guaranteed. We have no idea how things are going to unfold from here. So what can we say about the race going forward? First, I think the panic on the Republican side of the aisle is just delightful. They are freaking out. They are claiming it's illegal to replace your nominee. Well, Biden wasn't actually the nominee yet, so the Democratic Party can choose anyone they damn please at any time they want before the qualification deadline, which is sometime in mid to late August. So the fact that they are so freaked out speaks well. And why is that? Because guess who is now the old, doddering, confused fool? It's Donald Trump. He's running against a 59-year-old, vigorous, energetic, funny, articulate woman. And this is his worst nightmare because, of course, he cannot handle smart women. He cannot handle women who put him in his place. It is just oil and water. Remember how he has treated prosecutors who are women, like Tish James. Remember how he has treated judges, like Tanya Chutkin in D.C. He is incapable of being on stage, confronting, being taken down by a woman. He is at heart a deep misogynist. You know what he did to E. Jean Carroll. You know what his background is, and this is driving him nuts. Well, more nuts than he already is. So what does that mean? It means that Kamala Harris can finally begin taking the swings at him that Joe Biden, frankly, could not. Let's call Trump out for what he is: doddering, confused. He goes down cul-de-sacs of rhetoric, gets caught, freezes, comes up with sounds rather than words. He's nutty. He makes incoherent statements. He dreams up all kinds of weird, untrue conspiracy theories. Let her go after him and call him out for what he is: over the hill, nuts, and dangerous. Let her articulate that message very clearly. And I think for the first time, this is now about Trump, his agenda, 2025, their project for fascism, and the Supreme Court. Let the prosecutor go up against the predator. Let the prosecutor go up against the felon. Let her make the case that not only is he morally, legally, emotionally unfit, but that his project for America is dangerous and un-American. And I think she can do this to some degree much better than the president, in part because she's a trained lawyer, and in part because she is very disciplined in her speech. She doesn't go off on these, frankly, somewhat irritating tangents. Come on, guys. No, really, I'm not kidding. All those kinds of little demarcations and phrases. She is focused like a laser. She makes her point, she presents evidence, and then she moves on. So I think in terms of articulating a message, she will be much more effective. It's interesting. What is happening later this week? Bibi Netanyahu is coming to town. And I can imagine him furiously rewriting his speech. And here's why. He, and probably most of the world, assumed until yesterday that Biden would be the nominee and Biden would lose. And so he was prepared to suck up to Donald Trump and the Republicans and put a shiv in the side of President Biden. Well, now it's a whole new ballgame. And he could very well, I pray it will be, that he will be facing a President Harris next year. So he might want to start rewriting that speech, taking a few less swings at the United States, sounding a little bit more interested in a ceasefire proposal. So it'll be very interesting how he reacts to this. What we've seen from other world leaders is incredible appreciation for Biden. And if I have my tuned in ear, I would say relief. I think they saw that as magnificent as he was at diplomacy, at leading us through this dangerous time, the risk of losing with him was very great. These are world politicians as well as world leaders. So I think they could see what all of us could. And that was that the Democratic Party would be better off with Kamala than with Joe Biden. Now, she's going to have some choices to make in the days and weeks ahead. First of all, she is busy now accumulating endorsements and even pledged delegates for the convention. So I am sure that well before that convention, she's going to have all of the delegates that she needs to accept the nomination. Now, previously, the Democratic Party had planned on taking an early roll call vote. That was supposed to avoid some logistical problems with early ballot requirements in states like Ohio. And frankly, it was part of the Biden defense strategy that if they could lock him in early enough, then he wouldn't face a challenge at the convention. But I don't know that she wants to do that. I think the element of surprise, excitement is tremendous. It's a great asset. Why would she want to kind of preview that, ruin that sense of surprise, adulation, excitement that comes when a convention does something historic and different? So I suspect that early roll call is going to go by the wayside. Next, she's got to figure out who's going to be her vice president. And you have seen so many names on the possible VP list scramble very quickly to endorse her, because that is, of course, the entry ticket to the VP sweeps and stakes. They have to get on board with Kamala. I have a few of my favorites. You cannot begin the conversation without talking about Josh Shapiro, who is marvelous on the stump, on TV. He's shown he can govern in crises, whether it's I-95, whether it was the assassination attempt. He brings a critical swing state with him, and he is as energetic, as youthful as she, and yet he has gravitas. He is governing a very complex, very diverse, important electoral state. And I think he's got to be near, if not at the top of the list. Others, Mark Kelly. He is an astronaut. He is a Navy pilot. Apologies to the Navy. He has become, along with his wife, Gabby Giffords, an ardent advocate for gun safety laws. He comes from Arizona, which would be surely a nice state to secure. Biden won it narrowly last time. He might even help in places like Nevada, which is next door. And I think he brings a certain kind of down-to-earthness, gruffness, no messing around kind of attitude. And if you're looking for sort of a temperamental balance, she's very refined, very articulate. He's kind of down to earth and can be kind of no bars, no gruff. I think it would make an interesting balance in terms of gender, geography, temperament. And I think his experience in the military and as an astronaut would take J.D. Vance down several pegs, to put it mildly. I think you also have to look at someone like Andy Beshear. I know he's not a household name. He's the governor of Kentucky, but I have seen him up close. I've seen him in small rooms, in large rooms. He's incredibly down to earth. He can really communicate the Democratic message in a way that does not scare independents and moderates. So I think even though he's not going to bring Kentucky with him, that there is, again, a temperamental balance, a geographic balance that Kamala Harris is going to want to look at. You're going to also hear a lot about Roy Cooper. Now, Roy Cooper is the governor of North Carolina, and there are a couple problems. He is older. He is 67, and he looks a little bit older. Now, maybe that's not a problem for the vice president. Recall, Obama chose an older vice president in the form of Joe Biden. But if he leaves that post, the governorship goes to a Republican lieutenant governor for the meantime, and that's not a good thing. Now, there is an election coming up, and Josh Stein, who's the Democrat, hopefully will win that race. But that's something to think about as well. Now, he has a history with Kamala Harris. They were attorneys general together. So as she said the other day, she's known him for about 20 years. And do not discount that. Part of what you're looking for in a vice president is someone you trust, who you think will have your back, who is not going to try to upstage you, who is going to take direction from you, but also level with you. So he has a lot of those qualities. And I think, again, in terms of gender balance, geography balance, he makes a good pairing with Kamala Harris. And of course, I love Pete Buttigieg. There is no one who makes the case better than he, no one sharper than he on TV. He can go into Republican circles and knock them dead. He can explain complex policies in very down-to-earth terms. He is also a veteran. And I can only imagine what he would do to J.D. Vance. Can you imagine how he would cut him up in little pieces? That would be something to behold. Now, part of the consideration with Buttigieg is how closely Kamala wants to identify with the Biden administration. Certainly, she's going to take credit for all of the achievements, as she should. She was part of that team. But does she really want to pivot to perhaps a newer cast of characters or a different cast of characters? I could see, for example, Buttigieg coming back as chief of staff or as national security director or a very prestigious other position, either appointed or Senate confirmed in the administration, but maybe not as vice president. But this is going to be fun. And part of what you'll notice here is how deep the Democratic bench is. It's not like Republicans, who they have a bunch of nobodies and crackpots. Each one of these people we have gone through could win the presidency on his own. And I haven't even talked about the very capable women like Amy Klobuchar, Gretchen Whitmer. I think it may be a little bit too much to have two women. On the other hand, we never seemed to have a problem when we had two men on a presidential ticket. But be that as it may, there is a wide, deep bench on the Democratic side. And the fun thing about having Kamala move up to number one is one of these people gets to move into her slot and begin to establish his or her national credentials. So that's an exciting prospect. And when you think about it, look at the sense of relief, almost euphoria on the Democratic side. She raised $60 million or so in a single day after the announcement. People are just ecstatic. They want to win. They are finally hopeful that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think at the speed with which she has consolidated support, the number of people who have come out to endorse her has been a sign of just how desperate the Democratic Party is to come together, to unify, and to go after Trump hammer and tongs. Well, what do we think are some of the problems ahead? You are already seeing it on social media and elsewhere. The racism, the misogyny, it's coming out of the woodwork. You're going to see AI deep fakes. It is as disgusting as it has always been. You are also going to hear nervous white old donors on the Democratic side saying, I don't know if the country is ready for a Black woman. You're going to hear all of that. And she is going to have to deal with it. She's going to have to brush it off. She's going to have to rise above it. But it's coming. Don't make any mistake. It is coming. And there will be some people who say, well, I was going to vote for Joe Biden, but I'm not going to vote for her. I doubt it. I really doubt it. If you were ready to vote for Donald Trump when Joe Biden was the alternative, you, I am certain, are still a Trump voter. And if you had qualms about Trump because voting in the election because Trump was crazy and Biden was too old, you have a solution to your problem. So you're going to hear a lot of naysaying, a lot of voices that are clamoring for attention about race, about gender. You're going to hear people criticize her laugh. What is that about? Well, first of all, that's also racist and also sexist because Black women should what? Be demure, be subservient, be quiet, be seen but not heard. What's that all about? So you're going to see some of that. And no candidate is perfect. So brace yourselves. There will be bobbles. There will be gaffes. There will be missteps. No candidate runs a perfect race. But with Kamala, we have hope. We have an opportunity to make this the race it should be. The future of America versus the past. The rule of law versus a reign of criminals. Prosecutors and law and order people versus grifters. Internationalists who defend America's place in the world and people who suck up to dictators. People who are looking to improve the lot of working class Americans, middle class Americans, and those who are simply stuffing the pockets of billionaires, including all those Silicon Valley execs who are rooting for Trump in large part because he promises to sink the dollar. Think about that. Billionaires, once again, betting against America because that will make them crypto kings. That will get them money. That will make them rich. So be very clear who's on what side. Be very clear what the stakes are. And now, if you were flummoxed, if you were paralyzed, if you were depressed about the state of the election, now you have no excuse whatsoever. Go volunteer. Volunteer for a presidential campaign, a Senate campaign, a local campaign. Go volunteer, go give your money, go find groups that are getting ready to defend the election results, because of course the Republicans will be filing lawsuits and claiming foul even before the first votes are counted. And use your platform to explain the stakes. Tell people what Project 2025 is all about. Tell them it's a plan to create an authoritarian state. Tell them it's a plan to Christianize government, and use your platform to make the positive case for democracy. We're going to be okay if we get through this election. Yeah, we've got problems, but we now have smart, dynamic, capable leadership that is willing and able to take the baton from President Biden and carry us forward. So there you have it. Reason to cheer, reason for high spirits, and a reason to get to work. You know, we've all tried tons of ways to feel good after a night of partying and drinks. There are all sorts of hokey urban legends that don't work. But I found a science-backed product that actually does. It's a pre-alcohol probiotic from the brand Zbiotics. Their amazing probiotic was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Zbiotics pre-alcohol produces an enzyme that breaks this byproduct down, giving you a proactive solution that wards off feeling miserable the next day instead of a reactive approach like drinking electrolytes or eating greasy food. As a working journalist in Washington, D.C., your nights quickly fill up with business dinners and long talks with sources at their favorite bars. Throw in summer parties and a great nightlife opportunity in the city, and it all adds up. That's why I first gave Zbiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink a try. It was the night before a big deadline at a swanky restaurant with colleagues who dislike going home until the bar is closed. I felt great the next day. I was amazed. I knocked out my story in no time and felt so on top of my game that I got in my fitness session too. Thanks to Zbiotics, I'm more energized and excited for a busy work and social season. And Zbiotics pre alcohol can keep you living your best life too. You need to try it. So stock up on pre alcohol now for all of your summer barbecues, vacations, and next day responsibilities. Enhance your mornings with Zbiotics. Go to zbiotics.com/greenroom to get 15% off your first order when you use the code greenroom at checkout. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/greenroom and use the code greenroom at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, Zbiotics, for sponsoring this episode and all our good times. You can find the link in the show notes. It seems like virtually every issue, whether it's guns, whether it's crime, whether it's abortion, just about anything, becomes a legal issue in our society and eventually winds up at the Supreme Court. Many of you, along with me, have been frankly terrified, mortified by the radicalism, the partisanship, the financial corruption of our Supreme Court, and frankly are concerned that the most lawless part of our system may be the Supreme Court itself, which sounds like a contradiction, but it's really not. If those judges throw away the judge book and decide they're just going to decide might makes right, if you have 5 or even better 6 people, we get to make all the rules, then you have something that doesn't really resemble the American justice system. And you have instability, you have chaos, you have a system that is wildly out of joint with the popular views, popular mores, and values, and you reach a point of crisis. And frankly, I think we are approaching that point. And I think it not only affects the Supreme Court, but it trickles down to the lower courts. And you have a crisis of confidence in judges themselves. Well, there is no better person to explain this to us than a law professor. And a law professor who has written books on explaining the Constitution. Kim Wehle, I've known for many, many years. She's written great books like How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, How to Read the Constitution and Why. She has an upcoming book called The Pardon Power. She will be a familiar voice to many of you who watch cable news. She writes for The Bulwark, and she is just brilliant at explaining some of these concepts, helping us understand how the system has gotten off track and maybe how we might get it back on track. So I am thrilled to welcome to the show Kim. Kim, welcome to Jen Rubin's Green Room.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I am sure that you and many of the other legal scholars never dreamed they would be household words and names and public figures in the age of presidential politics. But it seems like just about everything becomes a legal and constitutional question.
Well, and I think it's really the second piece, the constitutional question. I've been teaching constitution-related law classes for a decade and a half, and we used to struggle to come up with exam hypos because they seem so impossible and nonsensical. And now sometimes it feels like we're in a simulation. It's hard to believe what's unfolding constitutionally every day almost.
It does. And I think many things that we believed about the structure of the Constitution appear to be, I don't want to say wrong, but not in sync with the current Supreme Court. So let's start there. Aside from the case overturning Chevron, aside from Dobbs, I really do think that the most consequential case was the immunity case, because in that, the Supreme Court, I think, changed our entire understanding of the executive and our entire understanding of our constitutional system. Explain for the audience whether you agree or not, and how they did that, or what they have done to the Constitution that takes us to a very different place than we used to be.
I completely agree with you. I think they basically not only amended the Constitution by taking out a Sharpie and redefining the power of the president, but in doing so, really altered the foundational structure of government. Many people have seen or heard the musical Hamilton, or some of us remember Schoolhouse Rock from the 1970s, No More Kings. The idea being that the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, was fought to throw off the mantle of a monarchy. And, dating way back to what's known as the divine right of kings. The idea is that the king's authority comes from the divine, and therefore there are no limits. And if you have rights, or you have mercy, or you are meted out punishment, it's really at the king's whim or the queen's whim, that there's really no constraints and limitations. And so one of the remarkable things, of course, about the American Constitution, which is, with small exceptions, the oldest written constitution on the planet, is that it took the monarchy and broke it into three parts. It's a three-headed monarchy. Then ultimately, everything, all the power, is derived from the people. I like to, for people that are kind of visual thinkers, which I am, I think of it as an upside down triangle. The power is broad, shared by the populace, and it trickles down to those who hold office. The Supreme Court flipped that and put it, right side up triangle, in essentially holding that the president can use official powers to commit crimes, and that there's not only nothing that can be done about it through the criminal justice system, even when the president's a private person, but that the Constitution itself protects the use of official power. And what do we mean by official power? It's the stuff we should worry about being abused. It's the use of commander-in-chief power. It's the use of the take care clause, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, spyware, all those things. I think the court took us on this detour and put people, I think, off the trail of how critical this is by making this distinction between official and unofficial acts. Jen, I don't care if a president abuses his unofficial power. I don't care if he lies in a deposition relating to a contested divorce. That doesn't affect me and my kids. It's the potential use of the official power. And I'll add one other thing, which is that this conservative, quote unquote, majority, I would replace that with the word radical, has duped many people in the American public into thinking that they read the plain text. Well, the plain text, and that constrains their power. The plain text of Article 1, in talking about impeachment, says even if someone's impeached, and people are impeached for the abuses of official power, right, high crimes and misdemeanors, they can be investigated, indicted, convicted, and sentenced criminally. So the court's ruling literally ignores that plain language of the Constitution. And even under Article 2, which gives the president his powers, it says he shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. That would include criminal laws. And what the court did is say, we are presuming, hypothetically, a president will commit crimes. That's what immunity is. We're starting from the foundation that you will not faithfully execute the laws. You actually violate the laws, and not violate civil laws. You'll violate criminal laws. We will assume presidents will be in their willy-nilly crime sprees in the Oval Office. We are going to hold, as a matter of the Constitution, somehow there's nothing the rule of law can do about that. Jen, it's astonishing. I think we couldn't even do this as voters with a constitutional amendment, which would take supermajorities in both houses of Congress and in the states. I think it would take another revolution
Yes.
to do that.
And Ketanji Brown Jackson made the point that you just did, that the court has it exactly backwards. That when you extend immunity to official acts, first of all the president need do is say, and here comes the official act. And secondly, he goes through the instruments of government. He goes through his advisors. He goes through the Justice Department. He goes through the executive branches. And the notion that, well, those people won't do it because they can be prosecuted runs headlong into the topic of your next book, which is the pardon power. If the president can commit crimes and promise his underlings that they will be pardoned, then the crime machine simply rolls on. Now, the court made a little bit of a feint, and I think it is really a feint, because when you break it down into specific situations, I think these divisions kind of collapse. They said that there are certain things that the president has absolute immunity for, things within his exclusive power. Then there's another category of things that they say, well, if it's official, it's presumed to have immunity. I guess my question is, how would you ever rebut the presumption? Because the court also said you can't even use evidence from that protected realm of official acts to prove that he has done something wrong, either in the official but non-exclusive area or in the unofficial act. So these categories that they think they've set up seem to me paper thin. They're basically a way of kind of waving one's wand and saying it's all covered, and the proof will be in the pudding. Donald Trump has now appealed his conviction in New York, which involves paying off a porn star. And the theory goes, well, I was in the Oval Office having conversations with Hope Hicks about paying off the porn star who I made a deal with before I got elected, and that must be covered too. Well, if that's covered, what isn't?
Well, and in addition, of course, they said that motive is irrelevant.
Correct.
So, and motive, what lawyers call mens rea, the state of mind is often what makes a distinguishes between nothing or civil liability for
Right.
like money damages and a crime. So, I think I agree with you completely, and I think, and I've heard, frankly, former counsel for Donald Trump in connection with the January 6th investigation say, well, we had to turn over information, and now with this kind of thing, we probably wouldn't have to, right? That is, you'd say you get a subpoena, maybe his advisors would want to be called to testify. And the argument is, expanding on this decision, listen, the court said that you can't even use evidence of official acts. So it's going to stall the investigations itself. And I know Bill Barr, former attorney general, has said, well, okay, a bribery, which is expressed in the Constitution as impeachable, that would still be prosecutable because it's not an official act to accept a bribe. But to your point, Jen, the part of the quid pro quo, you wouldn't be able to put in any evidence that you gave something in exchange for the money. That
Right.
would be off the table. And there's nothing against the law, just, having someone gift you money. So all of the stuff the other elements, I call it, when I talk about it with my students, when you're talking about elements of a crime, it's like parts of a recipe, right? If you can't put the baking powder in the cookies, you're not going to get cookies.
Right.
And the court took the key ingredients, the eggs, the salt, whatever, the flour, out of the recipe. So the entire thing falls down. And I'll say, and people haven't really talked about this. The court in, the Nixon, the unanimous decision in Nixon, in which Nixon said, I'm not going to turn over my tape recordings of Oval Office conversations. This is the heartbeat of executive power. I mean, these are the president's internal confidential deliberations with top advisors relating to national security and everything else. I'm not going to turn those over. The court said unanimously, no, you do, because the public has a right to know. I think this ruling, basically just makes executive privilege irrelevant, because
Correct.
now anything relating to an official act is now sacrosanct and confidential. And, again, another example that might be helpful for the people is to imagine that a president, famously Donald Trump says I could shoot someone in Fifth Avenue. Imagine a president that has a private handgun, personal handgun, that he keeps at his private weekend residence. He pulls it out and kills someone. I guess that's an unofficial act in theory. But if he directs someone within, the military or the Justice Department to assassinate someone pursuant to that chain of command, that's an official act. And for my money, that's the one I care about.
Right. Exactly. Now, it is not just this case, as if this would be bad enough. The court also made it extremely difficult to prosecute people for bribery. Speaking of bribery, because you can simply pay after the fact and suddenly it becomes a gratuity. The court has essentially said, we, the court, are going to decide from a clean slate whether the regulations of everything from the EPA to the FDA are a reasonable interpretation. We're not going to let those experts who know all that science figure this out. They have reversed 50 years of reproductive rights. They have essentially gone through every pillar of constitutional law and kind of ripped it out. What is this about? What do they have in mind, and what vision of constitutional law do you think they're propounding?
I think it's an abject power grab. They, in this immunity decision, they said, okay, here's some sacrosanct areas that are official and therefore immune, but we're not going to give you any guidelines for what's unofficial. There's nothing around the horrors of January 6th that we feel comfortable even saying is somehow unofficial. It's a reward for January 6th. And by the way, we'll let you know later which parts we think are official and unofficial under that. You talked about that sort of outer boundaries of official acts. So if it's expressed in the Constitution, it gets absolute immunity. If it's kind of executive-ish, and you had overcome that presumption by proving somehow the president wouldn't be chilled in doing presidential things if there could be criminal immunity, an impossible standard even without the limitations on evidence and even without the limitations on motive. But the court has said, we'll tell you. So the court, Jen, I think, has said, we are now the bosses of the entire Constitution. The six of us will tell you at some later point whether we'll let any type of criminal process against a former president go forward. And my concern is it leaves itself enough wiggle room to say, if it's a Joe Biden, then maybe there's enough wiggle room to uphold something like that. And you mentioned, you alluded to Loper Bright, which overruled this landmark decision in Chevron, which is, I've been teaching for many years. It's kind of theoretical and wonky, but the court did the same thing there. The court essentially said, okay, even if Congress says, listen, I'm passing a new law. I'm not an expert in how to store plutonium in a way that's safe. So I'm going to have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission put some meat on the bones of my law with all the experts in nuclear fuel. And Chevron said, if Congress makes that decision and the agency that's accountable to the president who's elected fills in those blanks, we're not going to second guess that because we're no more experts than Congress. So Chevron said, if Congress chooses someone to help them with legislation and that expert agency goes and does it without going off the rails, the courts aren't going to step in. What the court did in Loper Bright, these 6 justices, is said, oh, no, we get to override all of that. We get to override Congress's decision as to we want to choose experts in nuclear fuel storage to decide what to do about nuclear fuel storage. So we're going to override Congress. We're going to override the agency's regulations, but we won't tell you when. This is also this major questions doctrine we don't have to get into, but we're going to decide, we're going to step in under our authority under Marbury versus Madison, declare the law, and we're going to become the ultimate regulators of the government. So my concern is, again, just like it's just become political. So they've left enough wiggle room to, thumbs up on prosecutions of presidents we don't like because we've left enough wiggle room. We get to decide what's official and unofficial, and thumbs up on regulations we like, thumbs down on regulations we don't like. What are regulations we don't like? Environmental regulations. They've already started doing that. DEI regulations. They've already started doing that. Reproductive rights regulations. They've already started doing that. Healthcare regulations. So anything that is politically fraught and really should belong, according to our friend Justice Scalia, the conservative icon that now looks liberal, anything that is politically fraught, and Scalia would say belongs in the elected branches with the voters, now this supermajority of unelected kings and queen are now grabbing that power for themselves. So I think this, Jen, I think this is constitutionalizing minority rule. This is constitutionalizing a view of government. I wouldn't ask, what's the upside? The upside is if you like that minority radical conservative view of government, it is now entrenched in 6 people under the guise of the Constitution being the top law of the land. And without a Congress that's going to change the configuration of court or change how the court takes cases, its jurisdiction, lots of things we can talk about, I don't know what can be done about that, frankly. It can't be fixed at the ballot box, I don't think, without a new Congress.
And when you consider how minority-driven this is, I think listeners have to understand that the way you get to a Supreme Court is through a electoral college that can elect a president who does not have a majority of the votes, through a Senate in which a large majority can be created from a very sparsely populated group of states. So you have a minority of a minority choosing these people who then get to stay there for life and impose their will with now virtually no restrictions. This becomes the tyranny of the minority.
100%. And I would add to that, remember, there was a filibuster prior to Donald Trump. So there was a filibuster for Supreme Court justices, meaning you needed a supermajority in the Senate. Former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell got rid of that. So the last 3 justices, Coney Barrett, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, were put on with a bare majority in the Senate. So it is anti-democratic, Jen. It is foundationally anti-democratic. There are no limitations. This is a monarchy with black robes that then just created basically green-lighted tyranny in the White House. I know this is terrifying for people. But back to the other point with the pardon power, my book's coming out. You're absolutely right. You couple that immunity with prospective pardons, which is a shotgun in the closet. You have them come in. You still have to get your underlings to agree with you, right? And execute the plan to use official power. So they come in and you say, listen, I'll pardon you. The court gave lip service in this opinion to the idea that pardon power is an absolute right. So you say, listen, you go and commit a bunch of crimes for me. I will pardon you. It's a checkmate.
Yes.
And by the way, it'll never see the light of day. The public will never know about it because with immunity comes strict confidentiality. You can't have access to information regarding the execution of official power.
Now, to top this all off, or maybe to add to it, they have given license, in my view, to every crackpot right-wing theory selling lower court judges, give it a whirl. Why don't you try it? And we saw that just recently in the Mar-a-Lago case, where the last-minute appointee of the first Trump term, Eileen Cannon, who has made one Looney Tunes ruling after another, says, this special counsel law by which lots of people have been prosecuted, including Hunter Biden, by the way, including members of the first administration, the first Biden administration, the one that was sent to investigate President Biden on documents. After all, I Eileen Cannon, have decided that's unconstitutional, taking a page from the concurrence of Justice Thomas in the immunity case, and has now thrown out that entire case. Now, to understand how bizarre that is, you have to appreciate how completely dishonest it is. She writes that Jack Smith is acting in his like a private citizen. That's wrong. That's a lie. He is a member of the Justice Department. He's bound by Justice Department rules. His boss is the Attorney General. So what the heck is going on here, Kim?
Yeah, I mean, I could speak at some length on this because way back in the day, I actually worked for Ken Starr on the Whitewater investigation. And so listeners understand, I mean, the irony of this, Jen, is the whole point of special counsels, independent counsels, special prosecutors, they've come by different names. The whole point, back to our immunity discussion, is to keep presidents out of the business of using prosecutors for vengeance. That's the whole point, because Nixon, fired prosecutors to protect himself, the Saturday Night Massacre. So Congress passed a law called the Ethics in Government Act, which was a federal statute that created what was known as the Office of Independent Counsel. That was Ken Starr, who then investigated Bill Clinton. Justice Scalia wrote a famous dissent saying this is a super bad idea. It creates distorted incentives, which I actually agreed with him even at the time when I was reading that as a young lawyer inside the investigation. That's where I met Justice Brett Kavanaugh. That whole statute lapsed, and then DOJ created a regulatory framework for the same thing. But to your point, there are foundational statutes that created the Justice Department, and that's how the Justice Department hires and fires people, including lawyers and prosecutors. And there's different ways you can go on detail, what they call it. You can be borrowed from another agency as an assistant U.S. attorney. In that case I mentioned, it's called Morrison and versus Olson. The Supreme Court said, okay, this is not a principal cabinet level officer that has to go through Senate confirmation. So under the Constitution, heads of departments can appoint, special prosecutors. In that case, it was an independent counsel and it was appointed by judges. But essentially they said, listen, we call them inferior officers. It's plain in the Constitution. You can do this. So the argument that Cannon seemed to latch onto is, okay, sure, there's these generic statutes now that have been around forever, which is the special prosecutor in Watergate was under one of these generic statutes. Sure, everyone's all assumed that Department of Justice hires prosecutors. And they made this special one to protect people like Donald Trump. It's to protect targets. It's to make sure the Justice Department is not a witch hunt organization. It's to make sure that it makes decisions based on facts and law. It's to protect targets. She says, no, Congress needs to do something like they did with that independent counsel law, the Ken Starr law, that sunsetted. It needs to be really, really specific. It needs to do the appointment. It needs to appropriate the money. I mean, in that Nixon case I mentioned, it was a slightly different argument, but there was an argument that the special prosecutor had some kind of legal flaws, and a majority of the Supreme Court, a unanimous majority, said no. I mean, they're a legitimate legal entity. They can bring this claim to try to get these documents and these tapes from the White House. So I think what people need to understand is, there's creative lawyering since the dawn of time. And the Constitution is old, and it's terse, and it's vague, which is why this claim of textualism is a lie. There's no one way to read it. And so to your point, now that it's open season on rinky-dink crazy arguments that would never have gotten past go, as long as you can articulate, stand on your head, Cirque du Soleil, hang from the chandelier, then we like the outcome. We'll latch onto that argument. Then we have a new constitutional principle. And that's what we're seeing. In the old days, judges knew the higher ups at the Supreme Court weren't going to go for that.
Right. And in another era, even the 11th Circuit, which is considered a very conservative circuit, I am sure, would have rejected this out of hand. And if Jack Smith made a motion, which he should have made a long time ago, to boot her off the case, I am sure that even a conservative court would. But now they look over their shoulders and they see what's going on at the Supreme Court. They may well say, well, I don't know. Maybe this is right. And maybe that's the way the wind is blowing. So it not only incentivizes bad judging, but it paralyzes good judging and the ability of circuit courts, which are there to make sure that all these bad decisions don't trickle up to a level. But now, I don't know, what do you think the 11th Circuit is going to do? They must be kind of, looking both ways and saying, I don't know which way is the wind blowing. Where's our future here?
Well, when Eileen Cannon interfered in the FBI raid early on and appointed that special master, and I'm on public record as saying if that opinion was a law school exam, she would have gotten a C. It was so badly reasoned. The 11th Circuit was very forceful in saying N-O. But I'm going to say something a little bit off, probably off the beaten path, which I don't think it matters what the 11th Circuit does.
Right.
I really don't think it matters at all. That is, if Trump's elected, special counsels are just going to become completely irrelevant. The Supreme Court has green-lighted, vindictive prosecutions using the Justice Department. So, whether it's upheld or reversed, it's really irrelevant. If it goes on appeal and her ruling is upheld and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, as you know, Jen, the Justice Department can just use regular prosecutors, the ones that, the special counsel was designed to make sure we're dotting their, I's and crossing their T's and not being biased. They can do that in the next Democratic administration. If Donald Trump wins the White House, all bets are off for all of this. This will become an arcane footnote to history. Either way, this trial is not going forward before November because of the immunity ruling. So I think the appeal, I mean, you got to do it, but to me, it doesn't matter either way. Just don't do revoke the regulations and just use regular lawyers to prosecute Donald Trump. He hasn't, as you know, double jeopardy hasn't attached yet because they haven't gone to trial yet. So he can be prosecuted. People need to hear this. This 100% can go forward regardless of Eileen Cannon. There's probably venue in DC. And so they could refile it. They could tinker with it. It's all hanging in November, and the last week has been frankly terrifying, with the energy around Donald Trump and the gaslighting and the amnesia around how threatening he is to people's foundational rights.
Absolutely. Before we go forward on the courts, I have to double back. Was the Brett Kavanaugh that the same Brett Kavanaugh that we see on the court? Has he become more of an ideologue, more overreaching, or do you think this was kind of his mindset back when you knew him?
I don't think this is consistent with the Brett Kavanaugh I knew way back when. There are others that know him a lot better than I did. He was in my experience, even today, one of the most brilliant lawyers I've ever worked with or seen. He's extremely methodical and thoughtful. He spearheaded the investigation into Vince Fossler's suicide, and did it like any good lawyer would do. And when there was no there, that was that. There were other aspects of that investigation, which I think were predicted by Justice Scalia's dissent in Morrison, where essentially he's saying, listen, if you give prosecutors a subject matter and tell them go find a crime,
right,
they will spend an unlimited amount of time to find a crime. Ken Starr didn't find anything against the Clintons. If it's a traditional prosecutor and you say, here's your budget, here's a bunch of bad guys, go after the ones that you've got really, really, really good evidence and you'll get a conviction. That's just a different incentive and motivation. So, I've been surprised. I would have anticipated that he would be, more of an independent thinker and He's taught separation of powers for many years, and he's absolutely brilliant. And I understood him to really believe in divided government and believe, as I tell my students, every branch gets its papers graded by the other two branches. So, I have respect for him personally, and as I said, professionally. But yeah, to answer your question, this is not what I anticipated when he was put on the Supreme Court bench.
And what is remarkable is that both he and the Chief Justice, Justice Roberts, are now apparently to the right of Amy Coney Barrett, which surprises a lot of people who thought, oh, if you want a real right-wing rigid ideologue, she's the gal. But in fact, let's not confuse things, she's not even a moderate. But she has at times shown a level of restraint that even the Chief Justice hasn't. For example, in the immunity case, she didn't go for this business about not using evidence that you may have gained. And so she has shown more independence than these guys have. You wonder, like, what's the dynamic going? Is there a group think that kind of happens? Is there some personal interchange that's going on? What explains this sort of group think by essentially 5, sometimes 6 justices that has gotten so extreme? And yet she's kind of perhaps the only one that's still, kind of reachable through reason, through argument, through any kind of legal principle.
Well, she
What explains
seems, to have heart in some regard. But I'll say a few things. One is, of course, Sheldon White House Senator from Rhode Island has done a lot of work in public speaking around the amount of dark money that goes into Supreme Court nominations. And we're just in the dark on how that is, like hundreds of millions of dollars from Leonard Leo and others on the far right. So I'm not inside that. I don't really know why they do that, except to have some kind of expectation that there's going to be some bang for the buck. That's number one. Number two, I think some of the blame lies across the other side of the aisle. When Mitch McConnell stole Barack Obama's Supreme Court seat, who was Attorney General Merrick Garland, there's nothing in the Constitution about a Senate Majority Leader. It says advice and consent. It doesn't say that the Senate Majority Leader gets to be the gatekeeper of whether the president gets to exercise the core power of appointing judges. Barack Obama didn't even make a speech. There was no pushback whatsoever. There was no fight, and that was a substantial failure, I think, on that administration's part, because millions of women, at least when it comes to Dobbs and girls, are now paying the price with their own liberty and their own bodily integrity. And the other piece is, and I don't understand this either, in the majority in the immunity case, there's 3 appointees by Trump that we talked about, as well as Alito and Thomas, who have both established conflicts of interest. Thomas,
Yes.
whose wife participated in the January 6th, lead up to the insurrection, calling the White House, trying to encourage Mike Pence to, violate the Constitution and not gavel in the lawful president of the United States. And then you've got Justice Alito, of course, having stopped the steal propaganda on his two of his properties. And there's nothing really happening in the Senate to, not just for oversight legislation, but I'm not an expert in legislative procedure, but it seems like the Senate Judiciary Committee at a minimum could hold some hearings and could talk to experts on the Constitution, could maybe talk to some witnesses who know Ginny Thomas. I don't understand. And then the press would cover it and the people would be educated around it. The Democrats have not pushed back. And I'm flummoxed by that. Even in this moment, even after the immunity case, the Democrats are silent. There was a call to pass it off to the Department of Justice. Oh, we need a special counsel. No, this is your oversight responsibility. You're the United States Congress. And there's a lot of precedent for, if you go back historically, for Congress controlling the Supreme Court. It's up to Congress to decide how many justices. There have been 5, there have been 10. There's all kinds of things, and there's just paralysis.
Right. Now, let's say in a fantasy world that I hope it's not fantasy, but it probably is, that President Biden gets reelected. There's a House majority. There's a Democratic Senate majority, and those Senate Democrats are willing to make exceptions to the filibuster. What would you advise them to do about really the kind of intellectual, financial corruption of the Supreme Court and really some really terrible lower court judges? What do they do?
Oh gosh. I mean, that's a deep and wide question. It would be wonderful to be in that position. I think there needs to be probably some impeachments happening. As we talked about at the top, or at least inquiries, I know that sounds like a radical thing to say, but if we talk about changing the very charter foundation of our government, that's unacceptable. I mean, it's government by the people, and I'm not pointing fingers at any particular justices or judges, but that needs to happen. And then, and at least so the public can see what's going on. And I know people say, well, Congress is corrupt. It's all polarized. It's all partisan, all of that stuff. This is where we are, Jen, by taking, the conservative route. Congress, I did a piece for Politico, could legislate what's called standing doctrine, put into a step-by-step process constraints on the kinds of cases the Supreme Court can even hear. There'd be objections to that. They might say that's unconstitutional. I think it's probably wrong, but essentially to prevent the court from grabbing these massive culture war cases and doing these radical things, they could create a constitutional Supreme Court that handles some of these hot button cases. The Constitution doesn't say what the court looks like at all, and make sure that the justices come from various walks of life and different parts of the country. You could have lower federal judges rotate in and out of the Supreme Court. It wouldn't violate life tenure and salary protection because they're all there for life as well. There's President Biden commissioned a lengthy report. Larry Tribe, who, I've worked with, I'm sure you have, and other constitutional giants in the country who've thought about this for many years, participated in it. There's a lot of things Congress could do short of, quote, packing, unquote, the court, which gets this pejorative connotation. And I should know too, I did a law review article for one of the University of Pennsylvania law school journals right after Biden took office that looked back at Watergate. After Watergate, there was this real stream of legislation that Congress did to shore up the guardrails of democracy. And I think that was a missed opportunity for the Biden administration. They focused on Build Back Better and other things, and that was a lost opportunity. But I would say the next administration, if it is a Democrat and if there is still a functioning democracy, should put front and center plugging these holes.
One of the other things that it's funny that you should raise the issue of missed opportunities. There were many things in the first Trump administration that could be legislatively fixed. For example, you could put some teeth on the emoluments clause. You could prescribe a process for checking in with Congress and for Congress acting. You could, for example, put in criminal penalties for the Hatch Act, which prohibits elected officials from doing politicking on the job. And yet, the Biden administration didn't really do any of those things. It's not just the courts that obviously need some reinforcement. There are lots of things that could and probably should have been done on the executive level. What are some of the things that you wish had been done that you think would come in handy in terms of executive branch reforms and even on the congressional side to try to reinforce our democracy and prevent an imperial president?
Well, as a threshold matter, we have to look at the problems. I wrote a book on voting as well, as you know, the problems with the electoral system, and that the Constitution itself does not say anything about an affirmative right to vote. It says, listen, you can't make it so that you can't vote because you're a woman, or you can't vote based on being a racial minority. But it doesn't say thou shalt have a right to vote. And because of that, the Supreme Court, frankly, has gotten really cute in kneecapping
Yes.
a bunch of, critical voting rights legislation. So, I think there should be some potential constitutional reform. The Constitution's been amended 27 times. It can happen. And I would start with an affirmative right to vote, frankly, because that would require when courts get voting rights thing to put some questions, to put some weight on that side of the scale, right? So there's that. As far as as far as the executive branch and Congress. Also, the one thing that the Biden administration did do and the Congress did do is some fixing of the Electoral Count Act to avoid the possibility of a vice president upending an election. But there's all other kinds of problems with this, right? Where, even if you have a November election where the state by state it goes for a disfavored candidate with say this disfavored candidate for those that don't support democracy, say it's a Joe Biden or the Democratic nominee, there's shenanigans that can happen between November and December, right? And this is getting a lot into the weeds. So I think they need to do some stuff with that. Post Watergate, we saw a lot of oversight. Inspectors General programs were created. The Freedom of Information Act was enhanced. So there are others that are laid out in my law review article, but I think it has to come top to bottom with this idea that, as Madison said, ambition needs to be made to counteract ambition. If men were angels, we wouldn't need government. We have to all start from the premise that people will abuse power if they give it. You will blow through speed limits if there's no ticket, right? Once there's a ticket, you slow down. So I think there needs to be an across the board assessment of where those holes are, where people can take the ball and start abusing power. And first and foremost, of course, as we've been talking about, it's unfortunately the justices on the United States Supreme Court.
Well said. You've written a couple books before the one that you're working on now, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, How to Read the Constitution and Why. In writing those books, you must have talked to many readers, many voters, Americans. Do you think Americans grasp the importance of these issues? I think sometimes politicians, pundits kind of denigrate the average citizen, say they don't care, or democracy doesn't have meaning, or they're not concerned about these issues. What's been your take on the popular view of the Constitution and what we like to call the rule of law?
A lot of misinformation or lack of information. I mean, the Annenberg Center at Penn has done a survey every year of 3,000 respondents, and that's increased since the statistics favoring basic constitutional literacy has increased. But anywhere from a third to a fifth can't even name the three branches of government, or can't name, shocking numbers, can't name a single right protected under the First Amendment, or there's another study, it's old now, but a significant portion of Americans think Judge Judy's on the U.S. Supreme Court. So I think civic literacy is a real problem. But I'll tell you, you mentioned how to read the Constitution and why, what you need about voting and why, how to think like a lawyer and why, pardon power, how the pardon system works and why, which is out in September 2nd. The key is the and why, right? So I have 4 kids. I can explain to them how you get on a bike and how to ride a bike. Oh, you sort of balance on your tush and you do the pedals, and they have to get on the bike and they have to fall off the bike, and they have to, eventually they'll get it. People need to know with their common sense how the Constitution works and why it works the way it works, right? And so what I find, and I've started assigning that book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, to my 1Ls. And then after the first day in class, I'll say, what was surprising you the most? What surprised you the most? And they will say that there are 2 sides to arguments.
Oh, my.
I mean, something that foundational. I think our youth think there's a right and there's a wrong. There's this camp, there's that camp. And you get in your camp and you defend your camp. And, the analogy I like to use is a bridge over, a treacherous river. If the bridge is the Constitution, and you're fighting over whether it's red cars or blue cars, but no one's paying attention to the grouting of the bridge, and the bridge goes down, are the red cars going to survive? Or the blue cars going to survive? Everybody goes down. So people say, oh, I carry a constitution, pocket constitution, and that's irrelevant, right? It's been interpreted so many times. It's really the idea of why we have it and the understanding that rights for thee are rights for me, right? If somebody else's rights go, the bridge goes down and eventually it's your rights that go. And you want to just hope that the person in office, like a king, is going to bestow their mercy on you. That's no kind of government I want to live in. And I'll tell you the other thing, and people don't understand this, there's all this talk about authoritarianism, and now there's pushback that it's the Democrats that are demagoguing all that and all this. With the degradation of rights comes fear of speaking your truth, fear of saying something that's going to get you in trouble with someone who has the power, official power of the office. When you can't speak, then you start questioning your own thinking. And when you can't think independently or for yourself, you lose your very humanity. You lose what makes you. I did a keynote speech at an international free expression conference in Lillehammer, Norway this spring. And there were a lot of people that were poets and writers and journalists from Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
One of the women who had spoken the year before went back to Ukraine and was killed by a bomb 3 weeks later. These people understand what it looks like on the other side. They're fighting for their lives and the lives of their children, and the losses are staggering, and they're fighting still. Americans don't even have a whiff, including myself, this generation of Americans, of what is really at stake and what it will look like to not live in an environment where the government is that upside down triangle, where the power is in the voters and it trickles down to the powerful, not the other way around. And sometimes I wonder, if we have to have a taste of that before we'll really stand up and fight for it.
Well, I never thought it was more than a cliche, but when Ben Franklin was asked after the convention, what kind of government do you have? He famously replied, a republic if you can keep it. And for the first time in my life, I'm not sure whether we can keep it or not.
Yeah, and democracies die a lot. They've died in our lifetime. This isn't our birthright. This is not, the Constitution's a piece of paper. It's not going to enforce itself. It's not going to protect itself. It's a contract. It's a let's hold hands, and this is how we want to live. And there are many Americans who don't want it. There are Americans who want a dictatorship. And so I appreciate, Jen, the ability to talk about, let's have that debate. What do we want?
Right.
What government do we want? Let's name it and have an honest debate and respect each other in the process. Respect people across the aisle. Respect people who don't want a democracy. I want to hear why, because there's more that we share in common than really that what divides us. And I know that sounds cliche, but I really believe it. I really, really believe it. If we can find common ground and stop pointing fingers and stop putting people in boxes and stop shaming people, we can find some ways to move forward where we all live in with some kind of grace. I don't know. I know that sounds Pollyannish, but I have to hang on to it.
Well, Kim, I can understand why you're a very sought after teacher, because like your books, like your TV appearances, you lay it out logically, you break it down into common sense ideas, and I cannot recommend enough your books. I think they're great for sophisticated lawyers, and they're great for people who know nothing about the Constitution. So good luck with your new book, and thank you for coming on, and thank you for all the work you do trying to raise
I don't
the
know if
level.
everybody, most people know or not. You're a lawyer. You're in the first camp. You're the sophisticated lawyer, so it's quite a compliment coming from you. It's really a tremendous honor to be here, and thanks. And I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely. Take care. And that was Kim Wehle. Wow, I told you she is really smart and explains things really well. And if you feel very unsettled at this point, join the club, because as I said during the interview, for the first time in my life, I no longer feel like judges are playing it straight. I feel like the judiciary has gotten polluted by a form of partisanship and a form of aggressive power grabbing that we have never seen in this country. And they are tipping the scales deliberately in the direction of one party, one philosophy, and they are making stuff up as they go along, which creates instability, creates chaos, and frankly diminishes the respect of their institution. Remember, once upon a time, John Roberts was supposed to be an institutionalist. He was supposed to care about the goodness of the court. Well, frankly, in allowing them to run amok and not doing anything about the severe financial scandals and joining with the majority, leading the majority in some of the worst reasoned, most extreme decisions, he has done more to damage, I think, permanently the Supreme Court. And it's a tragedy for the court, but it's a tragedy for America because we need a Supreme Court. When Congress goes awry, when the executive goes awry, you need the courts there. They are supposed to be the bedrock of individual rights, individual liberties. They're supposed to keep the other two in check. And when they become the problem, when they become the power hungry branch, we're in deep, deep trouble. And I come back to the urgency of the moment. How do we reverse this? Well, it starts by stop digging. When you're in a hole, stop digging. And that means reelecting Democrats to the White House, to Congress. And then it entails, I think, a whole panoply of reforms, some of which Kim spoke about. Court reforms, executive branch reforms, and we have to take back our government. We are getting very far from the conception of rule by the majority and the basic bedrock principle, which is the power belongs to the people. So we should be very concerned about the crisis. We should not be despondent because despondency leads to paralysis, which means authoritarians win. But if you are now properly concerned about the state of the judiciary, then I think I did my job today. And I have Kim to thank for that. So there you have it. Listen, I rely on all of you to keep us on the air and in your home and in your ear. I rely on your comments. I want to hear from you. I think engagement is essential now that we're in this period of time. So write a question, write a comment. I will listen, I will respond. And tell your friends that this is a good place to have a polite, informed, high level conversation. That's what we need. We need to talk to one another. So I thank you all for joining me, and I do want to hear from you. So please let me know what you think. That's all for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.